All right, so Leviticus chapter 23. Again, it goes through all of the festivals that you can see on that table that I have printed out there. But before we look at the details of them, I did want to look at this, what I put on the bottom half of the, well, no, I'm sorry. I guess it's the top half of the second page of your handout. The number 7 in the yearly cycles. I did put that on the handout, right? Didn't I? No. In any case, we're going to talk about whether I put it on there or not. There's some interesting things going on here in how the cycle of festivals is laid out, and in some of the festivals themselves having to do with the number 7. And I think we understand that the number 7 is kind of a number of completeness in the Old Testament, and of course it's also associated specifically with creation because of the 6 days and the resting on the 7th day, and of course that all tied into the Sabbath as it's described for us in the Ten Commandments. And so, therefore, it's also interesting that at the beginning of chapter 23, when it sets out to give you the yearly cycle of feasts, it actually starts with the weekly cycle, which is 6 regular days and a Sabbath, repeating over and over again. So we have this cyclical nature and this concept, therefore, of sacred time, which I'm not going to go into, but I may accidentally say that phrase. So if you have questions about it, I guess you can ask them. So we can look at the yearly cycle, but it's prefaced with the weekly cycle. It talks about the Sabbath again for the 18,000th time here in the since we started in Exodus, reminding us about the Sabbath. So again, tying in the number 7, tying it all back to creation. So acknowledging creation as sanctified by God. We have this idea every week ends with acknowledgement of God in the setting aside of all of our worldly occupations to rest and focus on God. And of course, the importance of rest is in there, both physically and spiritually speaking. To rest from labors and also to rest in the Lord is all tied up in this idea of the Sabbath every week. So that 7 is there to begin with. Then we have this yearly cycle of feasts, and it starts in month 1. In fact, the month where we have Passover is just designated to be month 1 because of the Passover being there, right? It's the beginning. It's the establishment of the nation delivered from Egypt. Therefore, it becomes also the beginning of the year for that reason. So in month 1, we have the Passover, which briefly speaking acknowledges God as deliverer, followed immediately by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast. So it's our second use of 7 here. In fact, they're listed separately sometimes, but by the time we get to the New Testament, there are several passages where it becomes clear to us just from the way the terms is used that they're being used totally synonymously. People in the time of Jesus, if they say Passover, they usually mean, they sometimes just mean the specific Passover day, but a lot of times they mean the whole week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, too, when they say Passover. And sometimes they just say the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they mean Passover and the whole Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they're really, and thematically, they're basically all one thing. It's all a celebration and memorial of all the things that we looked at in chapter 12. Exodus, the Passover, the sacrifice of the lamb, the blood on the doorposts, the meal with no leavened bread, and God delivering his people from Egypt. So, 7-day feast, which is followed by the Feast of the First Fruits, which is an acknowledgement of the beginning of the barley harvest. And they have 2 harvest seasons in that area. So of the barley harvest, where of course if we want one main theme, is that God provides and sustains, and of course acknowledgement of that and thanksgiving by bringing in some barley sheaves and waving them at the altar, symbolically acknowledging that all my harvest is yours to the Lord. And then we have 7-week span, right? So there's our next repetition of 7 in the cycle. 7 weeks between the Feast of First Fruits and the Feast of Weeks, which is called the Feast of Weeks because you have to wait 7 weeks before you have the feast, which puts us into the 3rd month. And the Feast of Weeks is the one that's also called Pentecost by the time we get to the New Testament, which is just the kind of Greek word for that time period of 7 weeks plus a day in between. And this is a celebration of the beginning of the wheat harvest. So really, its theme is exactly the same. It's really just another first fruits ceremony, one for the barley harvest and then one 7 weeks later for the wheat harvest. And then the next thing we see happens in month 7, which is our next important 7 in the whole sequence, is that our next one starts in month number 7, which also breaks up the whole cycle into first half of the year and second half of the year stuff. The month 7 has the Feast of Trumpets, which becomes later known as Rosh Hashanah. You may have heard of it by that name. Talk about that a little bit later. Followed by the Day of Atonement, which we'll talk a lot about later, whether that's this week or next week, where, of course, the theme is God is Redeemer and God's mercy and things like that. And then the Feast of Booths, which once again is a 7-day feast. So there's our next iteration of 7 throughout this whole thing, where again the focus is on God as provider and sustainer, remembering back to the time in the wilderness. So it's I think it's useful to see all of that symbolism of the sevens, kind of as a broad overview before we go in and look at these specific feasts. Comments or questions about the number 7 there? Yeah.
I've always wondered about these were annual events, obviously, and how much time they spent every year celebrating these occasions. Like the first feast is 7 days, and then the Feast of Booths is 7 days. How many total days are they spending a year celebrating these feasts?
All of these feasts? Well, 21 or so days. So if you add up all the single day ones plus the two that are 7 days, it should come somewhere around there.
And they traveled for these, right? They all had.
Although there's an extra day in there a couple times too, so maybe it's 23. They call it a 7-day feast, but then there's also something you do on the 8th day. Too. So
They all had to travel for these, right?
not all of them. 3 of them. 3 of them are prescribed feasts where you have to travel. I have them. Well, actually, I don't think I did mark that out for you right here on the handout. But everyone's supposed to go to Jerusalem for the Passover and the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of the Tabernacles. So just those 3, not for all of them. But we'll see some of those details as we go through them. All right, so want to talk about the feast. Don't want to talk about the Sabbath again. We've talked about that a lot. But the first one then is the Passover. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on that either, because we've looked at that in detail when we were in Exodus in chapter 12. But I do want to review some of the main points here the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now let's go ahead and kind of talk about those together as a unit. It's clear that they were mostly considered that way as the Jews actually lived through the cycle. They're kind of all one thing. So this month that becomes known as Nisan. It was called something else back in Exodus when they were in Egypt, but later on that's what they called it. The way it's usually referred to here in the text is probably related to a Babylonian name that they started using after that time. But in any case, Nisan on the 14th is when we have the Passover, and then we have the unleavened bread for 7 days. Obviously, it's a memorial and a celebration, and really, it's kind of besides all the specific religious things, of course. It's also kind of an Independence Day celebration. I think we need to remember to think of it that way as well. That's when God brought them out of Egypt so they can become the nation that they are. They don't really become that nation until a little bit later, but that's really kind of the same way we celebrate Independence Day, right? We celebrate it from the time they said they were going to be independent, not from the time it actually happened. So it's kind of an Independence Day celebration for them as well. Again, one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts where you're supposed to go to Jerusalem. And if we, there are just so much imagery in all of the things. I just pulled out the sheet from the book of Exodus, chapter 12 notes. All the symbolism for the Passover, and then the bread takes up an entire outline page in my own notes to myself. This is just symbolism and important themes in Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. Right, we have the Passover lamb. We have the blood to cover the people and spare them from death. We have all of these themes which are clearly pointing to Christ. And of course, we have those verses which make this as explicit as you could possibly want it to be. Right? Sometimes we have to really look and see and dig through to see where the themes are pointing to Christ. But here we have, John 1:29, where John the Baptist just says, "Behold, the Lamb of God," and everyone knows what he means. When he's saying that, he means he's the Passover lamb. In 1 Corinthians 5:7, when Paul just says, "Christ, our Passover lamb," in case you didn't get the point, he will just tell you Jesus is the Passover lamb. And all the things, the spotless lamb, the sinlessness of Christ, the blood covering the sins, God calling us out of the world to become a church. All of this symbolism in the Passover that points to Christ. Again, there's lots more we could say. I was being relatively brief here because we have just recently covered this in the book of Exodus. But questions or things that you wanted to draw attention to in the Passover imagery?
I was just going to make a comment that he was crucified on the exact same day as they celebrated the Passover.
Oh, that's right. So the whole upper room and the Last Supper is all part of this the celebration of this festival. So again, we see all the imagery there clear as day in the Old Testament, but it's also true that Jesus very intentionally used the imagery and the context of it so that we would not miss the point. Other questions or comments you want to make about the Passover imagery and how it points to Christ? We're going to look at that as part of our theme for all of the feasts, how they point to Christ, and some of the details for the other ones. But again, there's a lot of details here, but I don't want to go over them in great detail because we did recently. Anything else? Yes.
I would say Sabbath points to Christ too.
Yes.
Because we have, it's the rest.
That's right. So I mentioned a minute ago that we have the concept of rest. We have the just literal physical rest, that it's good to work and it's good to rest. But there's the spiritual component of the concept of rest, resting in God. And there's a theme of return to rest is part of the big picture of our whole biblical story, because there's the in the garden, and then there's the difficulty of work because of the fall, et cetera, et cetera. And since that time, we have the continuous foreshadowing of a rest to come, a rest to come, a rest to come. The whole concept of a promised land and a land flowing with milk and honey is itself a very concrete thing for them, but it's also another foreshadowing of a greater spiritual rest that can come when we're restored into relationship with God. All right, so moving on to one we're probably less familiar with than the Feast of the First Fruits. The Feast of the First Fruits, and it's not a particularly complicated one. It's talked about here in our text, starting in verse 9, 9 through 14. There, if you want to glance along at the text while we're talking about some of its details. Again, it's the first month of the religious calendar, but it's going to be in the springtime. Is where it fits according to the seasons of the year. Again, it's a barley harvest. There is a little bit of argument historically in the various rabbinic traditions about exactly when you should celebrate the Feast of First Fruits, because all it really says in the text is once you get to the land and you have a harvest, and then it should be the day after the Passover. What Passover? Whichever Passover happens along when you come into the land. It doesn't actually say. The historic rabbinic tradition has always been that we should take it as referring to the ones they were just talking about in the passage before it, and that therefore it means or did I say Passover? I meant to say Sabbath. I can't remember what I said. It says that after a Sabbath. You should start the day after the Sabbath, is what it says. And then the question is, well, which Sabbath? And the official rabbinic, or even before there were rabbis, the official interpretation has always been it must be referring back to the Sabbath associated with the Passover and or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So historically speaking, the Feast of First Fruits actually overlaps with the Feast of Unleavened Bread to start. But then again, there has still historically been a couple different main ideas here, whether it means whatever day is actually a Sabbath day, or whether it's because the Passover itself is a Sabbath day. I don't know if you recall, but we have that kind of weird complication when reading through all of these laws that mention Sabbath, because every seventh day is a Sabbath, but also all the holy days are Sabbaths. So when you're reading about things in a context, especially of these feasts and holy days, and it mentions a Sabbath, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a day 7. It can be a Sabbath because it's a day 7, and it can also be a Sabbath because it's one of these days that's been specifically set aside by God for these other reasons are also Sabbaths. That's why there's a little bit of complication. So the main idea, I think the most common idea always has been that it should be the first Sunday after Passover, because of course a Sunday is a day after a Sabbath. The first Sunday after Passover. The more complicated version sounds like our way of designated Easter, which is the first day after the first Sabbath after Passover. Yes.
Since this is like a harvest festival, wouldn't it make more sense to be the first day after the Sabbath after you brought in the harvest? And the harvest can like change depending on the weather?
I suppose that might make sense, but that's not the way they think of it. They think of it in terms of linking it to the Passover. and or a Sabbath within that Passover week. One or the other is the two ways they've always thought that they should follow this rule. And then if you need a third option, based upon all of those variations there, and since the Passover is always a Sabbath, and since it's always on the 14th, they said, therefore, we should always just celebrate it on the 16th. So. All right, anyway. Leaving aside exactly which day in Nisan they have decided to celebrate it, this is how it is celebrated. It's celebrated with what is referred to as a wave offering. We read a little bit about that in chapters 1 through 7, where you bring just like a sheath of the grain in and goes to the altar and it's presented to the Lord as a representative of all of your harvest. Themes are reliance on God, thanksgiving to God, acknowledging that all we have is God's. And then it also involves the burnt offering of a male lamb. And like all burnt offerings, in case I forget to repeat this every single time, all burnt offerings come with a coordinated food and drink offering. So that's the Feast of First Fruits. How do we see Christ in the Feast of First Fruits? We have some interesting references. So for instance, 1 Corinthians 15:20. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. That's that whole segment where he says, if Christ weren't raised from the dead, how terrible that would be. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So this terminology is applied to Christ for us there in the Old Testament. It's also possible, some people would point out that the resurrection could have actually happened during the Feast of First Fruits to establish Christ as the first fruits. Because again, we said there's this connection in time between the Passover and the first fruits is only a couple days. So it could be that Christ died on the Passover and was raised on the festival of first fruits. I don't know if that's 100% confirmed, but that's a plausible concept.
I know I asked this question before, but if you just read it, it says, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to do this," right? And then it says, "On the day when you have wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb, a year old, without blemish, a burnt offering to the Lord." How many male lambs are being offered?
One. So that's an important issue here. And so in all of these feasts, besides the other things, there's always, maybe not quite always, but there's usually some additional comment about a burnt offering and some certain number of animals. And that certain number of animals is always just for everyone, not for each individual. And that'll make even a lot more sense when we get to the one where you have to offer 7 of this and 2 of this and 3 of that. Right? If every individual person were doing that, we would probably depopulate the herds, and that would be no good. But
1-year-old male lamb.
right, exactly. So the numbers of the burnt offerings associated with these festivals is for everyone. All right, questions about the first fruits?
What about where it says to bring your first fruits? Is everyone bringing something?
Now, see, I find that a little bit more ambiguous when I was trying just to study that too. There's some terminology here that makes it sound like everyone should bring something, but the segments here that give you an amount of something to do associated with the feast are usually interpreted by the Jewish people as what is offered on behalf of everyone. But all the ones that are celebrated as festivals also include everyone bringing stuff in so that together they can celebrate, especially the ones that require people to come to Jerusalem. But you have that historically in the celebrations, even the ones that aren't required to come, there's still people there, and some people like to come anyway, and there's going to be a celebration here or in our own hometown with the ones that are celebrations anyway. So there's a kind of everyone bringing thing associated there. All right, so Feast of Weeks, its description starts on verse 17 of chapter 23, where it says, "You shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, and you shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath." So again, that 50 days, right, 7 weeks, and then the next day after that makes 50 days, and that's where it gets the name Pentecost, which we're familiar with from the New Testament. They got tired of calling it the Festival of Weeks and called it the Festival of 50 Days, I guess, after a while. So 50 days after the first Sabbath after Passover, which is to say 49 days after the Festival of First Fruits. Again, it's another harvest festival. It's essentially another first fruits festival. It's just a different first fruits of the wheat harvest instead of first fruits of the barley harvest. This one does require a pilgrimage. You are supposed to come to Jerusalem for this one, once there is a Jerusalem to come to. And it's nothing about this here in the text, but as time goes by, the Jewish people begin to associate this celebration specifically also with the giving of the law on Sinai. So it becomes part of the celebration of the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost to celebrate the giving of the law. Because it does, at least roughly speaking, correspond in terms of timeline to the month of the year in which they arrived at Sinai. If you count how what Book of Exodus tells us about the time they were in the wilderness, it puts us at Sinai in the same month of the year that this counting of the festivals does. So is the reason why it ends up being also associated with the giving of the law. So, and there's a thematic kinship there of God as provider of the wheat harvest, God as provider of the law, and the law sustains us spiritually, like the wheat sustains us physically. So it makes sense thematically that way to tie in this as a celebration also of the giving of the law, which also makes it easier for us if we want to make a thematic tie-in with the reason for the waiting until Pentecost for the coming of the Holy Spirit, the establishment of the church with the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost maps a little bit better onto celebrating the giving of the law. To establish how we're going to be a people of God in the Old Testament than it does with the First Fruits Festival, although we can thematically link it to the concept of a First Fruits Festival as well. There's a little difference here, which is a little bit interesting. In the one called First Fruits Festival, they're supposed to take actual barley grains and offer them as a wave offering. Here in the Pentecost celebration, they're supposed to ground the wheat into flour and bake it into bread, and then it's bread which is offered as the wave offering here in the feast of weeks. Which, if you like to look for all the symbolism possible through things, may symbolize the people working within, doing their part in the work within God's creation, and then offering that back to the Lord. And then there's a huge number of burnt offerings associated here, more so than there were with the First Fruits Festival. And there's some interesting stuff going on here, because here in Leviticus, it says 7 lambs, a bull, and 2 rams is what should be offered. But when these issues are reviewed again in the book of Numbers, it says 7 lambs, 2 bulls, and 1 ram. And I think probably the most likely reason for the difference there is just some sort of copying error in how the texts have been passed down through the years. They probably originally both said the same thing, because that's the only difference there. Is it 2 bulls and a ram, or 2 rams and a bull there? But the rabbinic tradition, in what I hope by now you can see as typical of the way the rabbinic tradition would look at things, says, well, if it says 7 lambs, a bull, and 2 rams here, and it says 7 lambs, 2 bulls, and a ram right here, what we should do is offer 14 lambs, 3 bulls, and 3 rams. See, that way we will have done both. So that's historically, as far as we can tell, how it was. That's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah is the main rabbinic commentary on how to follow the law in practical terms, and that's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says you use both lists, and that way you know you got it right. And of course, they all come with their grain and drink offerings as well. And then there's also a sin offering of a male goat and a peace offering of 2 male lambs. And then an additional personal requirement of bringing free will offerings and a peace offering. So it's required that you do that. It's not required that it have any specific amount. I mean, that's what makes it a free will offering. You should bring something. And the peace offering, if you remember when we talked about that, the peace offering is offered and then, except for a couple of pieces, kept by the person offering it. And that's basically how it becomes a celebration for all of the people that are arriving in Jerusalem. Everyone brings a peace offering with them. It's officially dedicated, and then they keep it to eat during the celebration. And of course, if you want to see Christ in the Pentecost, we can see him, associated mostly with the concept of first fruits. We've already talked about that. We have association of Christ as the first fruits the same way as we did before. And if we take the later traditions as well, which would have been fully established before the time of Christ, the fulfillment of the law and new covenant, kind of new covenant church starting at the time. Associated of the giving of the Holy Spirit with the giving of the law. Questions about the springtime? Yes?
I was just wondering, would that 2 loaves that they're talking about, would that be a picture of the Jews and Gentiles coming into one body?
Well, I mean, this is the issue with symbolism, right? I think it's a bit of a strain to want to say that that's the reason God told them to use 2 loaves, is so that later we could say, see, 2 loaves. It's like the Jews and the Gentiles. But so yeah, you can always put more symbolism into something than was intended. That's the nature of this kind of a project. Sometimes the symbolism is explained for us, and we know. But if you want to find every possible piece of symbolism, then you are almost certainly going to find more symbolism than what is specifically put in the text for us to find. That's the nature of the brain's ability to find and relate ideas and patterns and things of that nature. So I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, look, here's 2 loaves, and the reason for the 2 loaves is that. But there's nothing wrong with using it as an illustration without making the claim that God specifically put it there on the purpose for making that illustration, right? You still can make that illustration and say, see, we are like 2 loaves. The Jews and the Gentiles in there is still okay. All right, so that's the end of the kind of spring cycle, and then we have to wait till month 7 to have the Feast of Trumpets. And the Feast of Trumpets is most often called these days Rosh Hashanah. So I don't know, you may have heard of the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah. But Rosh Hashanah means New Year, basically. Literally it means head of the year, but that's the Jewish Hebrew phrase, means New Year's. So you often hear it say the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, but it's on the 7th month, on the first day, which is weird. So they make a distinction. So they say, no. This is the civil New Year, right? The religious New Year is still the month of Nisan, where we have the Passover and all of that. This is something that kind of happens because of the Babylonian influence during the time of captivity for civil and administrative purposes, refer to this month, Tishri or Tishrei, depending on where you're reading it, is the New Year in the administrative sense. But anyway, that's why it's called Rosh Hashanah, which has nothing to do with trumpets. But it's here, it's the Feast of Trumpets, and it's the beginning of the 7th month, which means it's the beginning of the second half of the year. The Feast of Trumpets is interesting because it doesn't say much about it here. It doesn't give us much of anything as far as religious underpinnings for it. The only thing the text here tells us about it is that it's supposed to be a memorial. Memorial of what? It doesn't say that. It just says blow the trumpets and it's a memorial. Is all that we're actually told here in the text. And only a food offering is required here, unlike the rest of the feasts and festivals, with at least one animal burnt offering associated with it. So, what do we do with this? Again, historically, it has been treated by the Jewish people as basically the introduction or announcement of the important festivals to come. Because both of these other festivals that complete our list, the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles, are in this same month of Tishri. And this imagery of the blowing of a trumpet, we see it all throughout the Old Testament and in several references in the New Testament. Of course, the blowing of a trumpet is what? It's for catching your attention. It's for making an announcement. It's for calling the people to assemble. And that has historically been interpreted as calling everyone's attention to start preparing yourself for these important festivals to come this month. And, again, the only word we have here describing it is memorial, and really, memorial or remembrance is itself an important theme in the Old Testament. Because remembrance kind of equals relationship, right? So if you think that through, you can't really have an effective relationship with someone if you don't remember all the times you have spent together before, right? Everything going forward in a relationship is based upon all the things that have already happened in the relationship. So remembrance is very important in the concept of relationship. And there's a couple things we can look at here with this key theme of remembrance. Exodus chapter 6, verse 5 and 6 says this, "Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves. I remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment." So what is it? What's the importance of the word, I remembered my covenant here in this verse? Is it because we're afraid God had actually forgotten his covenant and is only now remembering? Oh yeah, I did make a covenant with those people. So we know that's not possible, right? That's not the way God works. So what is the importance of this phrase here applied to God? I remembered my covenant means what? That's right. So the word remembrance here, and in several other similar contexts, is not just that it's in my mind. It means I am going to do something associated with it. There's a covenant, and I'm going to fulfill it. That the remembrance includes the doing associated with what's being remembered. Look at, if you want to turn a couple pages ahead in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 40, we have this. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. Again, it has nothing to do with the possibility of having forgotten it. It has to do with how God's going to act on it, based upon how faithful the people have been, and whether they're repentant or not, will determine the ways in which God is going to act on the covenant. And in Numbers chapter 15, verse 37, we have this. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the corner of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner, and it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them. Not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all of my commandments. Be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. To be your God, I am the Lord your God." So we have this association with God remembering the covenant means he is now going to fulfill things that were promised in the covenant. And we have this concept of remembrance tied in here. Put tassels in your garments. Why? Because there's something magic about tassels? No. Because they're there so that you will remember, but then it doesn't end there, right? The tassels are there so that you will remember the law and do it, right? So remember the law, and remembering it means doing it. And following it.
Be like the Lord's Supper, do this in remembrance of me.
That's right. So an action associated with the concept of remembering is really important thematically, and so that has historically been tied into this Feast of Trumpets as well, because that word memorial is the one thing God says about it here in the text. So a rededication, and that leads into the preparation of the heart for the confessions and the repentance of the Day of Atonement, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, here's a trickier one. You may have noticed that all I wrote in my brief outline for where we see Christ in the tournaments is Christ in the Feast of Trumpets, question mark, question mark, question mark. I guess I don't find it as clear that there is a nice association with Christ in this Feast of Trumpets in and of itself. Obviously, if our main takeaway from it is it's prepare yourselves for the Day of Atonement, then obviously the Day of Atonement is all about Christ. So that obviously that connection with it when you think about it that way. However, I don't know if you've heard these things, or someday you may read about them or whatever, but there's a relatively large tradition within Christian interpretation to add prophetic and eschatological end times meanings to the Feast of Trumpets. Specifically, and then referring to the various times when trumpets are mentioned, having to do with last time's things. Trumpets announcing the return of Christ, and some people like to associate it with the beginning of the tribulation, various things along those lines. To me, that's just another example of you can find more symbolism in things than was intended to be there. Some people say that all three of the festivals in the second half of the year should be thought of in prophetic and eschatological terms, but I find that line of reasoning unconvincing, especially because the second thing that happens is the Day of Atonement. And obviously the Day of Atonement is all about the actual crucifixion of Christ, not about the return of Christ. But, other intelligent people that study the scriptures like to see the eschatological things in there and all the references to trumpets in Revelation and stuff like that. I'm less convinced that that's the best way to think about it. Questions, comments, insights from people who have recently studied the book of Revelation? Anything like that? You're going to go along with my lack of trying to put too much revelation into the Feast of Trumpets? All right.
Shadows, a lot of the types and things back in the covenant with shadows pointing to Christ. It may be, it may not be.
Yeah, again, everything, the whole thing obviously always points to Christ. And again, if the main thing of the trumpets is to point to the Day of Atonement, of course the Day of Atonement is all about Christ, so it certainly points to Christ in that sense. All right, which brings us to the Day of Atonement. Now, I've got two things about the Day of Atonement. I've got this much of a tiny little reference so that we can have something to say while we go through the whole thing for today. And then I also have this on the Day of Atonement. That's for next week. Because the Day of Atonement has so many interesting and important things in there. I want to say just a couple things about it today to put it in the context of the whole thing, and then we're going to come back for all of its interesting details next week. But we come at the Day of Atonement, which in Hebrew is Yom Kippur. That's just the literal interpretation of Yom Kippur as Day of Atonement. So you may have heard it called that on the 10th of this 7th month. It's not a celebratory feast. It's a solemn day of self-reflection. It's a fast rather than a feast. It's not required to go to Jerusalem, and that should make sense, right? To go to Jerusalem kind of implies a celebration, but it's not supposed to be a celebration. It's supposed to be a solemn reflection, and repentance, and confession. While all the details of these sacrifices are going on your behalf in Jerusalem at the tabernacle or temple, depending on where we are in the history of things. We're going to talk about all of the bull, the goat, and the rams so there's a bull, a goat, and 2 rams associated with the actual atonement sacrifices, but then there's additional burnt offerings, including a bull and 7 male lambs, sin offerings, including an additional male goat. You're probably aware that this is the only time that the high priest is allowed to go into the Holy of Holies and have any actual direct dealings with the ark. And of course, its themes are all about repentance and atonement, but also purification and renewal are associated here with the Day of Atonement. And again, we'll have many more things to say about this when we look at all the details, but obviously, Christ is all about the Day of Atonement, right? Christ is both the high priest offering the sacrifice and the sacrifice offered at the pictured in the Day of Atonement. Any generic types of overall questions or comments you want to say about this Day of Atonement? Again, we will look at all of its details and many, many symbolisms, and probably look at Hebrews and how it refers back to it all next week. All right, so after the Day of Atonement, we have the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, both kind of words for temporary shelters, tents, if you will. it's called Sukkot in Hebrew, but you probably don't care about that, on the 15th of this 7th month. And this one is one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. And it's also the other 7-day long feast. And this one gets complicated when you have to look at what all of the actual sacrifices involved with the feast are. But what's the main thing? Why booths or tabernacles or tents? Because they symbolize what? Yeah, they symbolize the sojourn in the wilderness, both the short one between and around Sinai the first time, and of course then the whole 40-year thing as well, where therefore it's a reminder of God sustaining the people in the time in the wilderness. But it's also tied to the end of harvest, right? So we had 2 beginning of harvest feasts. This is an end of harvest feast. And like has been common in other cultures, including our own, end of harvest feasts become Thanksgiving feasts. And in fact, the Plymouth Pilgrims, we have our whole story of the first Thanksgiving and all that kind of thing. We're very consciously thinking of the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles and how it's a end of harvest thanksgiving and recognition of what God has done when they were engaging in their Thanksgiving feasts. So we've got 7 days of bringing food offerings. We have 7 days you're supposed to celebrate, right? Celebrating is actually commanded here as a part of this. Not only are the people commanded to celebrate, they're commanded to rejoice, which is an interesting topic we may talk about here in a minute if we don't run all out of time. The command to rejoice and celebrate, to live in booths for 7 days, holy convocations before and after the 7 days, and huge numbers of burnt offerings because there's offerings every day of the 7 days. Again, these are sets of offerings for the whole nation, not individual. We're not going to go into the details of it. It's not really important for us exactly how many bulls and goats it was, but there's a different number for every day. Actually, it's weird. All the numbers are the same except the number of bulls. There's bulls, goats, and rams, and the number of bulls goes down 1 each day. During the feast, the rest of the numbers stay the same. I'm not going to do anything with the symbolism of decreasing numbers of bulls. What I do want to talk about is 2 things. 1, Christ in tabernacles, and 2, the command to rejoice. Can you really command someone to rejoice? What? Evidently you can. Yeah, see, that's a very good answer because it's right here in the text, been commanded to rejoice. How do we make sense of something like that? How do you deal with or respond to a command to rejoice? Any thoughts there? That's right. I mean, of course, you can sing whether you feel joyful or not, but singing tends to stimulate feeling joyful is one of the interesting things we find about this, right? If you're commanded to be joyful and you start acting joyful, you might find that you start feeling joyful. Also, is an interesting thing about this kind of thing, right? If you're commanded to worship and you worship whether you feel like it or not, the act of worshiping actually draws you closer to God, and then you feel worshipful as well. Not 100% of the time, obviously, but it has that tendency if you have any faithfulness in your worshiping at all. Yes.
Jesus or John, he said, if you know these things and you do them, happy are you.
That's right. So the doing of them brings with it, satisfaction and joy, going closer to God, and these things. Here's a quote from one of the books that I was reading talking about these things. In the scriptures, rejoicing is more than an emotional state or attitude of the heart. To rejoice is an embodied act of obedience expressed in approaching the Lord with offerings at the sanctuary. The heart is trained to rejoice in the Lord through the offering of worship. And one other little interesting side note here, later on in some of the post-exilic prophets, such as Zechariah, for instance, add a kind of eschatological theme to this celebration. It's because it's an in-gathering celebration, and start to add the concepts and the foreshadowings of God bringing in the Gentiles together with these themes of the celebration of tabernacles or booths. How do we see Christ in the Feast of Tabernacle and Booths? This is pretty easy to answer, especially if you've recently been studying the book of John and you can remember the things from chapters 6 and 7 of the book of John. This feast is a remembrance of the time in the wilderness, and the time in the wilderness was all about God providing the manna from heaven, which then Jesus said was really about him. So there's Jesus himself made a very specific tie-in between himself and the themes celebrated here in the Feast of Tabernacles, when he called himself the bread of life, and specifically talked about the manna coming down from heaven, because that's one of the key things to remember and rejoice about when they're celebrating this Feast of Tabernacles. And of course, the general idea that Christ tabernacles with us, right? Christ left, all the heavenly realities to dwell with us in an earthly body that incorporates these same kinds of themes of Christ dwelling with us. Question about that? All right, so we can review some other questions you have about the whole cycle feasts, if necessary, next time, and we will look in much greater detail about all the things happening in the Day of Atonement.